This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Daniel Harris. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. Chapter 14. Miss Crawley at Home. About this time there drove up to an exceedingly snug and well-appointed house in Park Lane a travelling chariot with a lozenge on the panels, a discontented female in a green veil and crimpled curls on the rumble, and a large and confidential man on the box. It was the equipage of our friend Miss Crawley, returning from Hants. The carriage windows were shut. The fat spaniel, whose head and tongue ordinarily lolled out of one of them, reposed on the lap of the discontented female. When the vehicle stopped, a large round bundle of shawls was taken out of the carriage by the aid of various domestics and a young lady who accompanied the heap of cloaks. That bundle contained Miss Crawley, who was conveyed upstairs forthwith, and put into a bed and chamber warmed properly as for the reception of an invalid. Messengers went off for her physician and medical man. They came, consulted, prescribed, vanished. The young companion of Miss Crawley, at the conclusion of their interview, came in to receive their instructions, and administered those antiphlogistic medicines which the eminent men ordered. Captain Crawley of the Life Guards rode up from Knightsbridge Barracks next day. His black charger pawed the straw before his invalid aunt's door. He was most affectionate in his inquiries regarding that amiable relative. There seemed to be much source of apprehension. He found Miss Crawley's maid, the discontented female, unusually sulky and despondent. He found Miss Briggs, her dame de campagne, in tears alone in the drawing-room. She had hastened home, hearing of her beloved friend's illness. She wished to fly to her couch, that couch which she, Briggs, had so often smoothed in the hour of sickness. She was denied admission to Miss Crawley's apartment. A stranger was administering her medicines, a stranger from the country, an odious Miss... Tears choked the utterance of the dame de campagne, and she buried her crushed affections and her poor old red nose in a pocket handkerchief. Rawdon Crawley sent up his name by the sulky femme de chambre, and Miss Crawley's new companion, coming tripping down from the sick-room, put a little hand into his as he stepped forward eagerly to meet her, gave a glance of great scorn at the bewildered Briggs, and beckoning the young guardsman out of the back drawing-room, led him downstairs into that now desolate dining parlour where so many a good dinner had been celebrated. Here these two talked for 10 minutes, discussing, no doubt, the symptoms of the old invalid above stairs, at the end of which period the parlour bell was rung briskly, and answered on the instant by Mr. Bowles, Miss Crawley's large confidential butler, who, indeed, happened to be at the keyhole during the most part of the interview. And the captain coming out, curling his mustachios, mounted the black charger pawing among the straw, to the admiration of the little blackguard boys collected in the street. He looked in at the dining-room window, managing his horse, which curvetted and capered beautifully. For one instant the young person might have been seen at the window, when her figure vanished, and, doubtless, she went upstairs again to resume the affecting duties of benevolence. Who could this young woman be, I wonder? That evening a little dinner for 2 persons was laid in the dining-room, when Mrs. Firkin, the lady's maid, pushed into her mistress's apartment, and bustled about there during the vacancy occasioned by the departure of the new nurse, and the latter and Miss Briggs sat down to the neat little meal. Briggs was so much choked by emotion that she could hardly take a morsel of meat. The young person carved a fowl with the utmost delicacy, and asked so distinctly for egg sauce that poor Briggs, before whom that delicious condiment was placed, started, made a great clattering with the ladle, and once more fell back in the most gushing hysterical state. "Had you not better give Miss Briggs a glass of wine?" said the person to Mr. Bowles, the large confidential man. He did so. Briggs seized it mechanically, gasped it down convulsively, moaned a little, and began to play with the chicken on her plate. "I think we shall be able to help each other," said the person with great suavity, "and shall have no need of Mr. Bowles' kind services. Mr. Bowles, if you please, we will ring when we want you." He went downstairs, where, by the way, he vented the most horrid curses upon the unoffending footman, his subordinate. "It is a pity you take on so, Miss Briggs," the young lady said with a cool, slightly sarcastic air. "My dearest friend is so ill, and won't see me," gurgled out Briggs in an agony of renewed grief. "She's not very ill any more. Console yourself, dear Miss Briggs. She has only overeaten herself. That is all. She is greatly better. She will soon be quite restored again. She is weak from being cupped and from medical treatment, but she will rally immediately. Pray console yourself and take a little more wine." "But why won't she see me again?" Miss Briggs bleated out. "Oh, Matilda, Matilda, after 23 years' tenderness! Is this the return to your poor Arabella?" "Don't cry too much, poor Arabella," the other said with ever so little of a grin. "She only won't see you because she says you don't nurse her as well as I do. It's no pleasure to me to sit up all night. I wish you might do it instead." "Have I not tended that dear couch for years?" Arabella said. "And now—" "Now she prefers somebody else. Well, sick people have these fancies and must be humoured. When she's well, I shall go." "Never, never!" Arabella exclaimed, madly inhaling her salts bottle. "Never be well or never go, Miss Briggs," the other said, with the same provoking good nature. "Pooh! She will be well in a fortnight, when I shall go back to my little pupils at Queen's Crawley, and to their mother, who is a great deal more sick than our friend. You need not be jealous about me, my dear Miss Briggs. I am a poor little girl without any friends or any harm in me. I don't want to supplant you in Miss Crawley's good graces. She will forget me a week after I am gone, and her affection for you has been the work of years. Give me a little wine, if you please, my dear Miss Briggs, and let us be friends. I'm sure I want friends." The placable and soft-hearted Briggs speciously pushed out her hand at this appeal, but she felt the desertion most keenly for all that, and bitterly moaned the fickleness of her Matilda. At the end of half an hour, the meal over, Miss Rebecca Sharp, for such, astonishing to state, is the name of her who has been described ingeniously as the person hereto, went upstairs again to her patient's room, from which, with the most engaging politeness, she eliminated poor Firkin. "Thank you, Mrs. Firkin, that will quite do. How nicely you make it! I will ring when anything is wanted." "Thank you," and Firkin came downstairs in a tempest of jealousy, only the more dangerous because she was forced to confine it in her own bosom. Could it be the tempest which, as she passed the landing of the first floor, blew open the drawing-room door? No, it was stealthily opened by the hand of Briggs. Briggs had been on the watch. Briggs too well heard the creaking Firkin descend the stairs, and the clink of the spoon and gruel basin the neglected female carried. "Well, Firkin?" says she, as the other entered the apartment. "Well, Jane?" "Worse and worse, Miss B," Firkin said, wagging her head. "Is she not better, then?" "She never spoke but once, and I asked her if she felt a little more easy, and she told me to hold my stupid tongue. Oh, Miss B, I never thought to have seen this day." And the waterworks again began to play. "What sort of person is this Miss Sharp, Firkin? I little thought, while enjoying my Christmas revels in the elegant home of my firm friends, the Reverend Lionel Delamere and his amiable lady, to find a stranger had taken my place in the affections of my still dearest Matilda." Miss Briggs, it will be seen by her language, was of a literary and sentimental turn, and had once published a volume of poems, Trills of the Nightingale, by subscription. "Miss B, they are all infatuated about this young woman," Firkin replied. "Sir Pitt wouldn't have let her go, but he daren't refuse Miss Crawley anything. Mrs. Bute at the rectory just as bad, never happy out of her sight. The captain quite wild about her. Mr. Crawley mortial jealous. Since Miss C was took ill, she won't have nobody near her but Miss Sharp. I can't tell for where nor for why, and I think somethink has bewidged everybody." Rebecca passed that night in constant watching upon Miss Crawley. The next night the old lady slept so comfortably that Rebecca had time for several hours comfortable repose herself on the sofa at the foot of her patroness's bed. Very soon Miss Crawley was so well that she sat up and laughed heartily at a perfect imitation of Miss Briggs and her grief, which Rebecca described to her. Briggs' weeping snuffle and her manner of using the handkerchief were so completely rendered that Miss Crawley became quite cheerful, to the admiration of the doctors when they visited her, who usually found this worthy woman of the world, when the least sickness attacked her, under the most abject depression and terror of death. Captain Crawley came every day, and received bulletins from Miss Rebecca respecting his aunt's health. This improved so rapidly that poor Briggs was allowed to see her patroness, and persons with tender hearts may imagine the smothered emotion of that sentimental female, and the affecting nature of the interview. Miss Crawley liked to have Briggs in a good deal soon. Rebecca used to mimic her to her face with the most admirable gravity, thereby rendering the imitation doubly piquant to her worthy patroness. The causes which had led to the deplorable illness of Miss Crawley and her departure from her brother's house in the country were of such an unromantic nature that they are hardly fit to be explained in this genteel and sentimental novel. For how is it possible to hint of a delicate female, living in good society, that she ate and drank too much, and that a hot supper of lobsters profusely enjoyed at the rectory was the reason of an indisposition which Miss Crawley herself persisted was solely attributable to the dampness of the weather? The attack was so sharp that Matilda, as his reverence expressed it, was very nearly off the hooks. All the family were in a fever of expectation regarding the will, and Rawdon Crawley was making sure of at least £40,000 before the commencement of the London season. Mr. Crawley sent over a choice parcel of tract to prepare her for the change from Vanity Fair and Park Lane for another world, but a good doctor from Southampton being called in time, vanquished the lobster which was so nearly fatal to her, and gave her sufficient strength to enable her to return to London. The baronet did not disguise his exceeding mortification at the turn which affairs took. While everybody was attending on Miss Crawley, and messengers every hour from the rectory were carrying news of her health to the most affectionate folks there was a lady in another part of the house, being exceedingly ill, of whom no one took any notice at all, and this was the lady of Crawley herself. The good doctor shook his head after seeing her, to which visit Sir Pitt consented, as it could be paid without a fee, and she was left fading away in her lonely chamber, with no more heed paid to her than a weed in the park. The young ladies, too, lost much of the inestimable benefit of their governess's instruction. So affectionate a nurse was Miss Sharp, that Miss Crawley would take her medicines from no other hand. Firkin had been deposed long before her mistress's departure from the country. That faithful attendant found a gloomy consolation on returning to London, in seeing Miss Briggs suffer the same pangs of jealousy and undergo the same faithless treatment to which she herself had been subject. Captain Rawdon got an extension of leave on his aunt's illness, and remained dutifully at home. He was always in her antechamber. She lay sick in the state bedroom, into which you entered by the little blue saloon. His father was always meeting him there, or if he came down the corridor ever so quietly, his father's door was sure to open, and the hyena face of the old gentleman to glare out. What was it set one to watch the other so? A generous rivalry, no doubt, as to which should be the most attentive to the dear sufferer in the state bedroom. Rebecca used to come out and comfort both of them, or one or the other of them rather. Both of these worthy gentlemen were most anxious to have news of the invalid from her little confidential messenger. At dinner, to which meal she descended for half an hour, she kept the peace between them, after which she disappeared for the night, when Rawdon would ride over to the depot of the 150th in Mudbury, leaving his papa to the society of Mr. Horrocks and his rum and water. She passed as weary a fortnight as ever mortal spent in Miss Crawley's sick room, but her little nerves seemed to be of iron, as she was quite unshaken by the duty and the tedium of the sick chamber. She never told until long afterwards how painful that duty was, how peevish a painted was the jovial old lady, how angry, how sleepless, in what horrors of death, during what long nights she lay moaning, and in almost delirious agonies respecting that future world which she quite ignored when she was in good health. Picture to yourself, O fair young reader, a worldly, selfish, graceless, thankless, religionless old woman, writhing in pain and fear, and without her wig. Picture her to yourself, and ere you be old, learn to love and pray. Sharp watched this graceless bedside with an indomitable patience. Nothing escaped her, and like a prudent steward she found a use for everything. She told many a good story about Miss Crawley's illness in after days, stories which made the lady blush through her artificial carnations. During the illness she was never out of temper, always alert. She slept light, having a perfectly clear conscience, and could take that refreshment at almost any minute's warning. And so you saw very few traces of fatigue in her appearance. Her face might be a trifle paler, and the circles round her eyes a little blacker than usual, but whenever she came out from the sick room she was always smiling, fresh and neat, and looked as trim in her little dressing gown and cap as in her smartest evening suit. The captain thought so, and raved about her in uncouth convulsions. The barbed shaft of love had penetrated his dull hide. 6 weeks, a propinquity, opportunity, had victimized him completely. He made a confidant of his aunt at the rectory, of all persons in the world. She rallied him about it. She had perceived his folly. She warned him. She finished by owning that little Sharp was the most clever, droll, odd, good-natured, simple, kindly creature in England. Rawdon must not trifle with her affections, though. Dear Miss Crawley would never pardon him for that. For she, too, was quite overcome by the little governess, and loved Sharp like a daughter. Rawdon must go away, go back to his regiment in naughty London, and not play with the poor artless girl's feelings. Many and many a time this good-natured lady, compassionating the forlorn life-guardsman's condition, gave him an opportunity of seeing Miss Sharp at the rectory, and of walking home with her, as we have seen. When men of a certain sort, ladies, are in love, though they see the hook and the string, and the whole apparatus with which they are to be taken, they gorge the bait nevertheless. They must come to it, they must swallow it, and are presently struck and landed gasping. Rawdon saw that there was a manifest intention on Mrs. Bute's part to captivate him with Rebecca. He was not very wise, but he was a man about town, and had seen several seasons. A light dawned upon his dusky soul as he thought through a speech of Mrs. Bute's. "Mark my words, Rawdon," she said, "you will have Miss Sharp one day for your relation." "What relation? My cousin, hey, Mrs. Bute? James's sweet on her, hey?" inquired the waggish officer. "More than that," Mrs. Bute said with a flash of her black eyes. "Not Pitt? He shan't have her. The sneak ain't worthy of her. He's booked to Lady Jane Sheepshanks." "You men perceive nothing. You silly, blind creature. If anything happens to Lady Crawley, Miss Sharp will be your mother-in-law, and that's what will happen." Rawdon Crawley, Esquire, gave vent to a prodigious whistle in token of astonishment at this announcement. He couldn't deny it. His father's evident liking for Miss Sharp had not escaped him. He knew the old gentleman's character well, and a more unscrupulous old... He did not conclude the sentence, but walked home, curling his mustachios, and convinced he had found a clue to Mrs. Bute's mystery. "By Jove, it's not too bad," thought Rawdon. "Too bad, by Jove! I do believe the woman wants the poor girl to be ruined in order that she shouldn't come into the family as Lady Crawley." When he saw Rebecca alone, he rallied her about his father's attachment in his graceful way. She flung up her head scornfully, looked him full in the face, and said, "Well, suppose he is fond of me. I know he is, and others too. You don't think I am afraid of him, Captain Crawley? You don't suppose I can't defend my own honour?" said the little woman, looking as stately as a queen. Why, give you fair warning. Look out, you know, that's all," said the mustachio twiddler. "You hint at something not honourable, then?" said she, flashing out. "Oh, gad, really, Miss Rebecca," the heavy dragoon interposed. "Do you suppose I have no feeling of self-respect because I am poor and friendless, and because rich people have none? Do you think, because I am a governess, I have not as much sense and feeling and good breeding as you gentlefolks in Hampshire? I'm a Montmorency. Do you suppose a Montmorency is not as good as a Crawley?" When Miss Sharp was agitated, and alluded to her maternal relatives, she spoke with ever so slight a foreign accent, which gave a great charm to her clear, ringing voice. "No," she continued, kindling as she spoke to the captain, "I can endure poverty, but not shame; neglect, but not insult; an insult from you." Her feelings gave way, and she burst into tears. "Hang it, Miss Sharp, Rebecca, by Jove, upon my soul, I wouldn't for £1,000. Stop, Rebecca!" She was gone. She drove out with Miss Crawley that day. It was before the latter's illness. At dinner she was unusually brilliant and lively, but she would take no notice of the hints, or the nods, or the clumsy expostulations of the humiliated, infatuated guardsman. Skirmishes of this sort passed perpetually during the little campaign, tedious to relate, and similar in result. The Crawley heavy cavalry was maddened by defeat, and routed every day. If the Baronet of Queen's Crawley had not had the fear of losing his sister's legacy before his eyes, he never would have permitted his dear girls to lose the educational blessings which their invaluable governess was conferring upon them. The old house at home seemed a desert without her, so useful and pleasant had Rebecca made herself there. Sir Pitt's letters were not copied and corrected, his books not made up, his household business and manifold schemes neglected, now that his little secretary was away. And it was easy to see how necessary such an amanuensis was to him, by the tenor and spelling of the numerous letters which he sent to her, entreating her and commanding her to return. Almost every day brought a frank from the baronet, enclosing the most urgent prayers to Becky for her return, or conveying pathetic statements to Miss Crawley regarding the neglected state of his daughter's education, of which documents Miss Crawley took very little heed. Miss Briggs was not formally dismissed, but her place as companion was a sinecure and a derision, and her company was a fat spaniel in the drawing-room, or occasionally the discontented firkin in the housekeeper's closet. Nor, though the old lady would by no means hear of Rebecca's departure, was the latter regularly installed in office in Park Lane. Like many wealthy people, it was Miss Crawley's habit to accept as much service as she could get from her inferiors, and good-naturedly to take leave of them when she no longer found them useful. Gratitude among certain rich folks is scarcely natural or to be thought of. They take needy people's services as their due. Nor have you, O poor parasite and humble hanger-on, much reason to complain. Your friendship for Dives is about as sincere as the return which it usually gets. It is money you love, and not the man, and were Croesus and his footman to change places, you poor rogue, who would have the benefit of your allegiance? And I am not sure that, in spite of Rebecca's simplicity and activity, and gentleness and untiring good humour, the shrewd old London lady, upon whom these treasures of friendship were lavished, had not a lurking suspicion all the while of her affectionate nurse and friend. It must have often crossed Miss Crawley's mind that nobody does anything for nothing. If she measured her own feelings toward the world, she must have been pretty well able to gauge those of the world towards herself. And perhaps she reflected that it is the ordinary lot of people to have no friends if they themselves care for nobody. Well, meanwhile Becky was the greatest comfort and convenience to her, and she gave her a couple of new gowns and an old necklace and shawl, and showed her friendship by abusing all her intimate acquaintances to her new confidant, than which there can't be a more touching proof of regard, and meditated vaguely some great future benefit, to marry her perhaps to Clump, the apothecary, or to settle her in some advantageous way of life, or, at any rate, to send her back to Queen's Crawley when she had done with her, and the full London season had begun. When Miss Crawley was convalescent and descended to the drawing-room, Becky sang to her, and otherwise amused her. When she was well enough to drive out, Becky accompanied her. And amongst the drives which they took, whither, of all places in the world, did Miss Crawley's admirable good nature and friendship actually induce her to penetrate, but to Russell Square, Bloomsbury, and the house of John Sedley, Esquire. Ere that event, many notes had passed, as may be imagined, between the two dear friends. During the months of Rebecca's stay in Hampshire, the eternal friendship had, must it be owned, suffered considerable diminution, and grown so decrepit and feeble with old age as to threaten demise altogether. The fact is, both girls had their own real affairs to think of. Rebecca her advance with her employers, Amelia her own absorbing topic. When the two girls met and flew into each other's arms with that impetuosity which distinguishes the behaviour of young ladies toward each other, Rebecca performed her part of the embrace with the most perfect briskness and energy. Poor little Amelia blushed as she kissed her friend, and thought she had been guilty of something very like coldness toward her. Their first interview was but a very short one. Amelia was just ready to go out for a walk. Miss Crawley was waiting in her carriage below, her people wondering at the locality in which they found themselves, and gazing upon honest Sambo, the black footman of Bloomsbury, as one of the queer natives of the place. When Amelia came down with her kind smiling looks, Rebecca must introduce her to her friend. Miss Crawley was longing to see her, and was too ill to leave her carriage. When, I say, Amelia came down, the Park Lane shoulder-knot aristocracy wondered more and more that such a thing could come out of Bloomsbury, and Miss Crawley was fairly captivated by the sweet blushing face of the young lady who came forward so timidly and so gracefully to pay her respects to the protector of her friend. "What a complexion, my dear! What a sweet voice!" Miss Crawley said, as they drove away westward after the little interview. "My dear Sharp, your young friend is charming. Send for her to Park Lane, do you hear?" Miss Crawley had good taste. She liked natural manners. A little timidity only set them off. She liked pretty faces near her, as she liked pretty pictures and nice china. She talked of Amelia with rapture half a dozen times that day. She mentioned her to Rawdon Crawley, who came dutifully to partake of his aunt's chicken. Of course, on this Rebecca instantly stated that Amelia was engaged to be married to a Lieutenant Osborne, a very old flame. "Is he a man in a line regiment?" Captain Crawley asked, remembering after an effort, as became a guardsman, the number of the regiment, the th. Rebecca thought that was the regiment. "The captain's name," she said, "was Captain Dobbin." "A lanky, gawky fellow," said Crawley, "tumbles over everybody. I know him. And Osborne's a goodish-looking fellow, with large black whiskers?" "Enormous," Miss Rebecca Sharp said, "and enormously proud of them, I assure you." Captain Rawdon Crawley burst into a horse laugh by way of reply, and being pressed by the ladies to explain, did so when the explosion of hilarity was over. "He fancies he can play at billiards," said he. "I won 200 of 'em at the Cocoa Tree. He play, the young flat! He'd have played for anything that day, but his friend Captain Dobbin carried him off, hang him." Rawdon, don't be so wicked," Miss Crawley remarked, highly pleased. "Why, ma'am, of all the young fellows I've seen out of the line, I think this fellow's the greenest. Tarquin and Ducasse get what money they like out of him. He'd go to the deuce to be seen with the lord. He pays their dinners at Greenwich, and they invite the company. And very pretty company, too, I dare say." "Quite right, Miss Sharp. Right as usual, Miss Sharp. Uncommon pretty company, ha ha!" And the captain laughed more and more, thinking he had made a good joke. "Rawdon, don't be naughty," his aunt exclaimed. "Well, his father's a city man, immensely rich, they say. Hang those city fellows, they must bleed, and I've not done with him yet, I can tell you. Ha ha!" "Fie, Captain Crawley, I shall warn Amelia. A gambling husband!" "Horrid, ain't he, hey?" the captain said with great solemnity, and then added, a sudden thought having struck him, "God, I say, ma'am, we'll have him here." "Is he a presentable sort of person?" the aunt inquired. "Presentable? Oh, very well. You wouldn't see any difference," Captain Crawley answered. "Do let's have him, when you begin to see a few people, and his, what d'ye call him, his inamorato, Miss Sharp? That's what you call it, comes. Gad, I'll write him a note, and have him, and I'll try if he can play piquet as well as billiards." "Where does he live, Miss Sharp?" Miss Sharp told Crawley the lieutenant's town address, and a few days after this conversation, Lieutenant Osborne received a letter, in Captain Rawdon's schoolboy hand, and enclosing a note of invitation from Miss Crawley. Rebecca dispatched also an invitation to her darling Amelia, whom, you may be sure, was ready enough to accept it when she heard that George was to be of the party. It was arranged that Amelia was to spend the morning with the ladies of Park Lane, where all were very kind to her. Rebecca patronized her with calm superiority. She was so much the cleverer of the two, and her friends so gentle and unassuming, that she always yielded when anybody else chose to command, and so took Rebecca's orders with perfect meekness and good humour. Miss Crawley's graciousness was also remarkable. She continued her raptures about little Amelia, talked about her before her face as if she were a doll, or a servant, or a picture, and admired her with the most benevolent wonder possible. I admire that admiration which the genteel world sometimes extends to the commonalty. There is no more agreeable object in life than to see the Mayfair folks condescending. Miss Crawley's prodigious benevolence rather fatigued poor little Amelia, and I am not sure that of the three ladies in Park Lane she did not find honest Miss Briggs the most agreeable. She sympathized with Griggs as with all neglected or gentle people. She wasn't what you call a woman of spirit. George came to dinner. Repast en garçon with Captain Crawley. The great family coach of the Osbornes transported him to Park Lane from Russell Square, where the young ladies, who were not themselves invited, and professed the greatest indifference at that slight, nevertheless looked at Sir Pitt Crawley's name in the Baronetage, and learned everything which that work had to teach about the Crawley family and their pedigree, and the Binkies, their relatives, etc., etc. Rawdon Crawley received George Osborne with great frankness and graciousness, praised his play at billiards, asked him when he would have his revenge, was interested about Osborne's regiment, and would have proposed piquet to him that very evening, but Miss Crawley absolutely forbade any gambling in her house, so that the young lieutenant's purse was not lightened by his gallant patron, for that day at least. However, they made an engagement for the next, somewhere, to look at a horse that Crawley had to sell, and to try him in the park, and to dine together, and to pass the evening with some jolly fellows. "That is, if you're not on duty to that pretty Miss Sedley," Crawley said with a knowing wink. "Monstrous nice girl, 'pon my honour, though, Osborne," he was good enough to add. "Lots of tin, I suppose, eh?" Osborne wasn't on duty. He would join Crawley with pleasure, and the latter, when they met the next day, praised his new friend's horsemanship, as he might with perfect honesty, and introduced him to 3 or 4 young men of the first fashion, whose acquaintance immensely elated the simple young officer. "How's little Miss Sharp, by the by?" Osborne inquired of his friend over their wine, with a dandified air. "Good-natured little girl, that. Does she suit you well at Queen's Crawley? Miss Sedley liked her a good deal last year." Captain Crawley looked savagely at the lieutenant out of his little blue eyes, and watched him when he went up to resume his acquaintance with the fair governess. Her conduct must have relieved Crawley if there was any jealousy in the bosom of that life guardsman. When the young men went upstairs, and after Osborne's introduction to Miss Crawley, he walked up to Rebecca with a patronizing, easy swagger. He was going to be kind to her and protect her. He would even shake hands with her, as a friend of Amelia's, and saying, "Ah, Miss Sharp, how do you do?" held out his left hand towards her, expecting that she would be quite confounded at the honour. Miss Sharp put out her right forefinger, and gave him a little nod, so cool and killing that Rawdon Crawley, watching the operations from the other room, could hardly restrain his laughter as he saw the lieutenant's entire discomfiture, the start he gave, the pause, and the perfect clumsiness with which he at length condescended to take the finger which was offered for his embrace. "She beat the devil, by Jove," the captain said in a rapture, and the lieutenant, by way of beginning the conversation, agreeably asked Rebecca how she liked her new place. "My place?" said Miss Sharp, coolly. "How kind of you to remind me of it. It's a tolerably good place. The wages are pretty good. Not so good as Miss Ritt's, I believe, with your sisters in Russell Square. How are those young ladies? Not that I ought to ask." "Why not?" said Mr. Osborne, amazed. "Why, they never condescended to speak to me, or to ask me into their house whilst I was staying with Amelia. But we poor governesses, you know, are used to slights of that sort." "My dear Miss Sharp!" Osborne ejaculated. "At least in some families," Rebecca continued. "You can't think what a difference there is, though. We are not so wealthy in Hampshire as you lucky folks in the city. But then I am in a gentleman's family, good old English stock. I suppose you know Sir Pitt's father refused a peerage. And you see how I am treated. I am pretty comfortable. Indeed, it is rather a good place. But how very good of you to inquire." Osborne was quite savage. The little governess patronized him and persifled him until this young British lion felt quite uneasy, nor could he muster sufficient presence of mind to find a pretext for backing out of this most delectable conversation. "I thought you liked the city families pretty well," he said haughtily. "Last year, you mean, when I was fresh from that horrid vulgar school? Of course I did. Doesn't every girl like to come home for the holidays? And how was I to know any better? But oh, Mr. Osborne, what a difference 18 months' experience makes! 18 months spent, pardon me for saying so, with gentlemen. As for dear Amelia, she, I grant you, is a pearl, and would be charming anywhere. There now, I see you are beginning to be in a good humour. But oh, these queer odd city people! And Mr. Joss, How's that wonderful Mr. Joseph? It seems to me you didn't dislike that wonderful Mr. Joseph last year, Osborne said kindly. How severe of you! Well, on to the news. I didn't break my heart about him. Yet if he had asked me to do what you mean by your looks, and very expressive and kind they are too, I wouldn't have said no. Mr. Osborne gave a look as much to say, Indeed, how very obliging. What an honour to have had you for a brother-in-law, you are thinking? To be sister-in-law to George Osborne, Esquire, son of John Osborne, Esquire, son of... What was your grandpa, Mr. Osborne? Well, don't be angry. You can't help your pedigree, and I quite agree with you that I would have married Mr. Joe Sedley, for could a poor penniless girl do better? Now you have the whole secret. I'm frank and open. Considering all things, it was very kind of you to allude to the circumstance. Very kind and polite. Amelia, dear, Mr. Osborne and I were talking about your poor brother Joseph. How is he? Thus was George utterly routed. Not that Rebecca was in the right, but she had managed most successfully to put him in the wrong. And now he shamefully fled, feeling, if he stayed another minute, that he would have been made to look foolish in the presence of Amelia. Though Rebecca had had the better of him, George was above the meanness of tale-bearing or revenge upon a lady, only he could not help cleverly confiding to Captain Crawley, next day, some notions of his regarding Miss Rebecca, that she was a sharp one, a dangerous one, a desperate flirt, etc., in all of which opinions Crawley agreed laughingly, and with every one of which Miss Rebecca was made acquainted before 24 hours were over. They added to her original regard for Mr. Osborne. Her woman's instinct had told her that it was George who had interrupted the success of her first love passage, and she esteemed him accordingly. I only just warn you, he said to Rawdon Crawley with a knowing look. He had bought the horse, and lost some score of guineas after dinner. I just warn you. I know women, and counsel you to be on the lookout. Thank you, my boy, said Crawley, with a look of peculiar gratitude. You're wide awake, I see. And George went off, thinking Crawley was quite right. He told Amelia of what he had done, and how he had counselled Rawdon Crawley, a devilish good, straightforward fellow, to be on his guard against that little sly, scheming Rebecca. Against whom? Amelia cried. Your friend the governess. Don't look so astonished. Oh, George, what have you done? Amelia said. For her woman's eyes, which love had made sharp-sighted, had in one instant discovered a secret which was invisible to Miss Crawley, to poor Virgin Biggs, and above all, to the stupid peepers of that young whiskered prig, Lieutenant Osborne. For as Rebecca was shawling her in an upper apartment, where these two friends had an opportunity for a little of that secret talking and conspiring which formed the delight of female life, Amelia, coming up to Rebecca and taking her two little hands in hers, said, Rebecca, I see it all. Rebecca kissed her. And regarding this delightful secret, not one syllable more was said by either of the young women. But it was destined to come out before long. Some short period after the above events, and Miss Rebecca Sharp still remaining at her patroness's house in Park Lane, one more hatchment might have been seen in Great Gaunt Street, figuring amongst the many which usually ornament that dismal quarter. It was over Sir Pitt Crawley's house, but it did not indicate the worthy baronet's demise. It was a feminine hatchment, and indeed a few years back had served as a funeral compliment to Sir Pitt's old mother, the late Dowager Lady Crawley. Its period of service over, the hatchment had come down from the front of the house, and lived in retirement somewhere in the back premises of Sir Pitt's mansion. It reappeared now for poor Rose Dawson. Sir Pitt was a widower again. The arms quartered on the shield along with his own were not, to be sure, poor Rose's. She had no arms. But the chairs painted on the scutcheon answered as well for her as for Sir Pitt's mother, and Resurgam was written under the coat, flanked by the Crawley dove and serpent. Arms and hatchments, Resurgam. Here is an opportunity for moralizing. Mr. Crawley had tended that otherwise friendless bedside. She went out of the world strengthened by such words and comfort as he could give her. For many years his was the only kindness she ever knew, the only friendship that solaced in any way that feeble, lonely soul. Her heart was dead long before her body. She had sold it to become Sir Pitt Crawley's wife. Mothers and daughters are making the same bargain every day in Vanity Fair. When the demise took place, her husband was in London attending to some of his innumerable schemes, and busy with his endless lawyers. He had found time, nevertheless, to call often in Park Lane, and to dispatch many notes to Rebecca, entreating her, enjoining her, commanding her to return to her young pupils in the country, who were now utterly without companionship during their mother's illness. Miss Crawley would not hear of her departure, for though there was no lady of fashion in London who would desert her friends more complacently as soon as she was tired of their society, and though few tired of them sooner, yet as long as her engouement lasted her attachment was prodigious, and she clung still with the greatest energy to Rebecca. The news of Lady Crawley's death provoked no more grief or comment than might have been expected in Miss Crawley's family circle. "I suppose I must put off my party for the 3rd," Miss Crawley said, and added after a pause, "I hope my brother will have the decency not to marry again." "What a confounded rage Pitt will be in if he does," Rawdon remarked, with his usual regard for his elder brother. Rebecca said nothing. She seemed by far the gravest and most impressed of the family. She left the room before Rawdon went away that day, but they met by chance below as he was going away after taking leave, and had a parley together. On the morrow, as Rebecca was gazing from the window, she startled Miss Crawley, who was placidly occupied with a French novel, by crying out in an alarmed tone, "Here's Sir Pitt, ma'am!" and the baronet's knock followed this announcement. "My dear, I can't see him. I won't see him. Tell Bowles not at home. Or go downstairs, and say I'm too ill to receive anyone. My nerves really won't bear my brother this moment," cried out Miss Crawley, and resumed the novel. "She's too ill to see you, sir," Rebecca said, tripping down to Sir Pitt, who was preparing to ascend. "So much the better," Sir Pitt answered. "I want to see you, Miss Becky. Come along and me into the parlour," and they entered that apartment together. "I want you back at Queen's Crawley, miss," the baronet said, fixing his eyes upon her and taking off his black gloves and his hat with its great crape hatband. His eyes had such a strange look, and fixed upon her so steadfastly, that Rebecca Sharp almost began to tremble. "I hope to come soon," she said in a low voice, "as soon as Miss Crawley is better, and return to the dear children." "You've said so these 3 months, Becky," replied Sir Pitt, "and still you go hanging on to my sister, who will fling you off like an old shoe when she's wore you out. I tell you I want you. I'm going back to the funeral. Will you come back? Yes or no?" "I daren't. I don't think it would be right to be alone with you, sir," Becky said, seemingly in great agitation. "I say again, I want you," Sir Pitt said, thumping the table. "I can't get on without you. I didn't see what it was till you went away. The house all goes wrong. It's not the same place. All my accounts has got muddled again. You must come back. Do come back. Dear Becky, do come." "Come as what, sir?" "Come as Lady Crawley, if you like," the baronet said, grasping his crape hat. "There, will that satisfy you? Come back and be my wife. You're vit vort. Birth be hanged. You're as good a lady as ever I see. You've got more brains in your little finger than any baronet's wife in the county. Will you come? Yes or no?" "Oh, Sir Pitt!" Rebecca said, very much moved. "Say yes, Becky," Sir Pitt continued. "I'm an old man, but a good un. I'm good for 20 years. I'll make you happy, z if I don't. You shall do what you like, spend what you like, and 'ave it all your own way. I'll make you a settlement. I'll do everything regular. Look year!" And the old man fell down to his knees and leered at her like a satyr. Rebecca stared back a picture of consternation. In the course of this history we have never seen her lose her presence of mind, but she did now, and wept some of the most genuine tears that ever fell from her eyes. "Oh, Sir Pitt!" she said. "Oh, sir, I'm married already." End of chapter 14. Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Daniel Harris. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, Chapter 15, in which Rebecca's husband appears for a short time. Every reader of a sentimental turn, and we desire no other, must have been pleased with the tableau with which the last act of our little drama concluded, for what can be prettier than an image of Love on his knees before Beauty? But when Love heard that awful confession from Beauty that she was married already, he bounced up from his attitude of humility on the carpet, uttering exclamations which caused poor little Beauty to be more frightened than she was when she made her avowal. "Married? You're joking!" the baronet cried, after the first explosion of rage and wonder. "You're making fun of me, Becky. Who'd ever go to marry you without a shilling to your fortune?" "Married! Married!" Rebecca said, in an agony of tears, her voice choking with emotion, her handkerchief up to her ready eyes, fainting against the mantelpiece, a figure of woe fit to melt the most obdurate heart. "Oh, Sir Pitt, dear Sir Pitt, do not think me ungrateful for all your goodness to me. It is only your generosity that has extorted my secret." "Generosity be hanged!" Sir Pitt roared out. "Who is it to, then, you're married? Where was it?" "Let me come back with you to the country, sir. Let me watch over you as faithfully as ever. Don't separate me from dear Queen's Crawley." "The feller has left you, has he?" the baronet said, beginning, as he fancied, to comprehend. "Well, Becky, come back to us if you like. You can't eat your cake and have it. Anyways, I made you a bare offer. Come back as governess. You shall have it all your own way." She held out one hand. She cried fit to break her heart. Her ringlets fell over her face, and over the marble mantelpiece where she laid it. "So the rascal ran off, eh?" Sir Pitt said with a hideous attempt at consolation. "Never mind, Becky. I'll take care of ye." "Oh, sir, it would be the pride of my life to go back to Queen's Crawley and take care of the children and of you as formerly, when you said you were pleased with the services of your little Rebecca. When I think of what you have just offered me, my heart fills with gratitude. Indeed it does. I can't be your wife, sir. Let me be your daughter." Saying which, Rebecca went down on her knees in a most tragical way, and taking Sir Pitt's horny black hand between her own two, which were very pretty and white, and as soft as satin, looked up in his face with an expression of exquisite pathos and confidence, when the door opened, and Miss Crawley sailed in. Mrs. Firkin and Miss Biggs, who happened by chance to be at the parlour door soon after the baronet and Rebecca entered the apartment, had also seen accidentally, through the keyhole, the old gentleman prostrate before the governess, and had heard the generous proposal which he made her. It was scarcely out of his mouth when Mrs. Firkin and Miss Briggs had streamed up the stairs, had rushed into the drawing room where Miss Crawley was reading the French novel, and had given that old lady the astounding intelligence that Sir Pitt was on his knees, proposing to Miss Sharp. And if you calculate the time for the above dialogue to take place, the time for Briggs and Firkin to fly to the drawing room, the time for Miss Crawley to be astonished, and to drop her volume of Pigault le Brun, and the time for her to come downstairs, you will see how exactly accurate this history is, and how Miss Crawley must have appeared at the very instant when Rebecca had assumed the attitude of humility. "It is the lady on the ground, and not the gentleman," Miss Crawley said, with a look and voice of great scorn. "They told me that you were on your knees, Sir Pitt. Do kneel once more, and let me see this pretty couple." "I have thanked Sir Pitt Crawley, ma'am," Rebecca said, rising, "and have told him that I never can become Lady Crawley." "Refused him!" Miss Crawley said, more bewildered than ever. Briggs and Firkin at the door opened the eyes of astonishment and the lips of wonder. "Yes, refused," Rebecca continued with a sad, tearful voice. And am I to credit my ears you absolutely proposed to her, Sir Pitt? The old lady asked. Yes, said the baronet, I did. And she refused you, as she says? Yes, Sir Pitt said, his features on a broad grin. It does not seem to break your heart, at any rate, Miss Crawley remarked. Not a bit, answered Sir Pitt, with a coolness and good humour which set Miss Crawley almost mad with bewilderment. That an old gentleman of station should fall on his knees to a penniless governess, and burst out laughing because she refused to marry him. That a penniless governess should refuse a baronet with 4,000 a year. These were mysteries which Miss Crawley could never comprehend. Surpassed any complications of intrigue in her favourite Pigault le Brun. I'm glad you think it good sport, brother, she continued, groping wildly through this amazement. Famous, said Sir Pitt. Who'd have thought it? What a sly little devil! What a little fox it was! He muttered to himself, chuckling with pleasure. Who'd have thought what? Cried Miss Crawley, stamping with her foot. Pray, Miss Sharp, are you waiting for the Prince Regent's divorce that you don't think our family good enough for you? My attitude, Rebecca said, when you came in, ma'am, did not look as if I despised such an honour as this noble man has deigned to offer me. Do you think I have no heart? Have you all loved me, and been so kind to the poor orphan, deserted girl, and am I to feel nothing? Oh, my friends! Oh, my benefactors! May not my love, my life, my duty try to repay the confidence you have shown me? Do you grudge me even gratitude, Miss Crawley? It is too much. My heart is too full. And she sank down in a chair so pathetically that most of the audience present were perfectly melted with her sadness. Whether you marry me or not, you're a good little girl, Becky, and I'm your friend, mind, said Sir Pitt, and putting on his crape-bound hat, he walked away, greatly to Rebecca's relief, for it was evident that her secret was unrevealed to Miss Crawley, and she had the advantage of a brief reprieve. Putting her handkerchief to her eyes, and nodding away honest Briggs, who would have followed her upstairs, she went up to her apartment, while Briggs and Miss Crawley, in a high state of excitement, remained to discuss the strange event, and Firkin, not less moved, dived down into the kitchen regions and talked of it with all the male and female company there. And so impressed was Mrs. Firkin with the news that she thought it proper to write off by that very night's post with her humble duty to Mrs. Bute Crawley and her family at the rectory, and Sir Pitt has been and proposed for to marry Miss Sharp, wherein she has refused him, to the wonder of all. The two ladies in the dining room, where worthy Miss Briggs was delighted to be admitted once more to a confidential conversation with her patroness, wondered to their heart's content at Sir Pitt's offer and Rebecca's refusal. Briggs very acutely suggesting that there must have been some obstacle in the shape of a previous attachment, otherwise no young woman in her senses would ever have refused so advantageous a proposal. You would have accepted it yourself, wouldn't you, Briggs? Miss Crawley said kindly. Would it not be a privilege to be Miss Crawley's sister? Briggs replied with meek evasion. Well, Becky would have made a good Lady Crawley after all, Miss Crawley remarked, who was mollified by the girl's refusal, and very liberal and generous now that there was no call for her sacrifices. She has brains in plenty, much more wit in her little finger than you have, my poor dear Briggs, in all your head. Her manners are excellent, now I have formed her. She is a Montmorency, Briggs, and blood is something, though I despise it for my part, and she would have held her own amongst those pompous, stupid Hampshire people much better than that unfortunate ironmonger's daughter. Briggs coincided as usual, and their previous attachment was then discussed in conjectures. Your poor friendless creatures are always having some foolish tendre, Miss Crawley said. You yourself, you know, were in love with a writing master. Don't cry, Briggs, you're always crying, and it won't bring him to life again. And I suppose this unfortunate Becky has been silly and sentimental, too. Some apothecary, or house steward, or painter, or young curate, or something of that sort. Poor thing, says Briggs, who is thinking of 24 years back, and that hectic young writing master whose lock of yellow hair, and whose letters, beautiful in their illegibility, she cherished in her old desk upstairs. Poor thing! Poor thing, says Briggs. Once more she was a fresh-cheeked lass of 18. She was at evening church, and the hectic writing-master and she were quavering out of the same psalm-book. After such conduct on Rebecca's part, Miss Crawley said enthusiastically, our family should do something. Find out who is the object, Briggs. I'll set him up in a shop. Or order my portrait of him, you know. Or speak to my cousin, the bishop, and I'll doter Becky, and we'll have a wedding, Briggs, and you shall make the breakfast and be a bridesmaid. Briggs declared that it would be delightful, and vowed that her dear Miss Crawley was always kind and generous, and went up to Rebecca's bedroom to console her and prattle about the offer, and the refusal, and the cause thereof, and to hint at the generous intentions of Miss Crawley, and to find out who was the gentleman that had the mastery of Miss Sharp's heart. Rebecca was very kind, very affectionate and affected, responded to Briggs' offer of tenderness with grateful fervour, owned there was a secret attachment, a delicious mystery. What a pity Miss Briggs had not remained half a minute longer at the keyhole! Rebecca might, perhaps, have told more, but 5 minutes after Miss Briggs' arrival in Rebecca's apartment, Miss Crawley actually made her appearance there, an unheard of honour. Her impatience had overcome her. She could not wait for the tardy operations of her ambassadress, so she came in person, and ordered Briggs out of the room. And expressing her approval of Rebecca's conduct, she asked particulars of the interview, and the previous transactions which had brought about the astonishing offer of Sir Pitt. Rebecca said she had long had some notion of the partiality with which Sir Pitt honoured her, for he was in the habit of making his feelings known in a very frank and unreserved manner. But, not to mention private reasons with which she would not for the present trouble Miss Crawley, Sir Pitt's age, station, and habits were such as to render a marriage quite impossible, and could a woman with any feeling of self-respect and any decently listen to proposals at such a moment, when the funeral of the lover's deceased wife had not actually taken place? Nonsense, my dear, you would never have refused him had there not been someone else in the case, Miss Crawley said, coming to her point at once. Tell me the private reasons. What are the private reasons? There is someone. Who is it that has touched your heart? Rebecca cast down her eyes and owned there was. You have guessed right, dear lady, she said with a sweet, simple, faltering voice. You wonder at one so poor and friendless having an attachment, don't you? I have never heard that poverty was any safeguard against it. I wish it were. My poor dear child, cried Miss Crawley, who was always quite ready to be sentimental. Is our passion unrequited, then? Are we pining in secret? Tell me all, and let me console you. I wish you could, dear madam, Rebecca said in the same tearful tone. Indeed, indeed, I need it. And she laid her head upon Miss Crawley's shoulder and wept there so naturally that the old lady, surprised into sympathy, embraced her with an almost maternal kindness, uttered many soothing protests of regard and affection for her, vowed that she loved her as a daughter, and would do everything in her power to serve her. And now who is it, my dear? Is it that pretty Miss Sedley's brother? You said something about an affair with him. I'll ask him here, my dear, and you shall have him. Indeed you shall. Don't ask me now, Rebecca said. You shall know all soon. Indeed you shall. Dear, kind Miss Crawley, dear friend, may I say so? That you may, my child, the old lady replied, kissing her. I can't tell you now, sobbed out Rebecca. I am very miserable. But oh, love me always. Promise you will love me always. And in the midst of mutual tears, for the emotions of the younger woman had awakened the sympathies of the elder, this promise was solemnly given by Miss Crawley, who left her little protégée, blessing and admiring her as a dear, artless, tender-hearted, affectionate, incomprehensible creature. And now she was left alone to think over the sudden and wonderful events of the day, and of what had been and what might have been. What think you were the private feelings of begging her pardon, of Mrs. Rebecca? If, a few pages back, the present writer claimed the privilege of peeping into Miss Amelia Sedley's bedroom, and understanding with the omniscience of the novelist all the gentle pains and passions which were tossing upon that innocent pillow, why should he not declare himself to be Rebecca's confidant too, master of her secrets, and sealed keeper of that young woman's conscience? Well then, In the first place, Rebecca gave way to some very sincere and touching regrets that a piece of marvellous good fortune should have been so near to her, and she actually obliged to decline it. In this natural emotion every properly regulated mind will certainly share. What good mother is there that would not commiserate a penniless spinster, who might have been my lady, and have shared 4,000 a year? What well-bred young person is there in all Vanity Fair, who will not feel for a hard-working, ingenious, meritorious girl, who gets such an honourable, advantageous, provoking offer, just at the very moment when it is out of her power to accept it? I am sure our friend Becky's disappointment deserves and will command every sympathy. I remember one night being in the fair myself, at an evening party. I observed old Miss Toady there also present, single out for her special attentions and flattery little Mrs. Briefless, the barrister's wife, who is of a good family certainly, but, as we all know, is as poor can be. What, I asked in my own mind, can cause this obsequiousness on the part of Miss Toady? Has Briefless got a county court, or has his wife had a fortune left her? Miss Toady explained presently, with that simplicity which distinguishes all her conduct. You know, she said, Mrs. Briefless is granddaughter of Sir John Redhand, who is so ill at Cheltenham that he can't last 6 months. Mrs. Briefless' papa succeeds, so you see she will be a baronet's daughter. And Toady asked Briefless and his wife to dinner that very next week. If the mere chance of becoming a baronet's daughter can procure a lady such homage in the world, surely we may respect the agonies of a young woman who has lost the opportunity of becoming a baronet's wife. Who would have dreamed of Lady Crawley dying so soon? She was one of those sickly women that might have lasted these 10 years, Rebecca thought to herself, in all the woes of repentance. And I might have been my lady. I might have led that old man whither I would. I might have thanked Mrs. Bute for her patronage, and Mr. Pitt for his insufferable condescension. I would have had the town-house newly furnished and decorated. I would have had the handsomest carriage in London, and a box at the opera, and I would have been presented next season. All this might have been, and now all was doubt and mystery. But Rebecca was a young lady of too much resolution and energy of character to permit herself much useless and unseemly sorrow for the irrevocable past. So, having devoted only the proper portion of regret to it, she wisely turned her whole attention towards the future, which was now vastly more important to her. And she surveyed her position, and its hopes, doubts, and chances. In the first place, she was married. That was a great fact. Sir Pitt knew it. She was not so much surprised into the avowal as induced to make it by a sudden calculation. It must have come some day, and why not now as at a later period? He who would have married her himself must at least be silent with regard to her marriage. How Miss Crawley would bear the news was the great question. Misgivings Rebecca had, but she remembered all Miss Crawley had said, the old lady's avowed contempt for birth, her daring liberal opinions, her general romantic propensities, her almost doting attachment to her nephew, and her repeatedly expressed fondness for Rebecca herself. She is so fond of him, Rebecca thought, that she will forgive him anything. She is so used to me that I don't think she could be comfortable without me. When the éclaircissement comes, there will be a scene, and hysterics, and a great quarrel, and then a great reconciliation. At all events, what use was there in delaying? The die was thrown, and now or tomorrow the issue must be the same. And so, resolved that Miss Crawley should have the news, the young person debated in her mind as to the best means of conveying it to her, and whether she should face the storm that must come, or fly and avoid it until its first fury was blown over. In this state of meditation she wrote the following letter. Dearest friend, the great crisis which we have debated about so often is come. Half my secret is known, and I have thought and thought until I am quite sure that now is the time to reveal the whole of the mystery. Sir Pitt came to me this morning and made, what do you think? A declaration in form. Think of that! Poor little me! I might have been Lady Crawley. How pleased Mrs. Bute would have been, and ma tante if I had taken precedence of her. I might have been somebody's mamma instead of... Oh, I tremble when I think how soon we must tell all. Sir Pitt knows I am married, and not knowing to whom, is not very much displeased as yet. Ma tante is actually angry that I should have refused him. But she is all kindness and graciousness. She condescends to say that I would have made him a good wife, and vows that she will be a mother to your little Rebecca. She will be shaken when she first hears the news, but need we fear anything beyond a momentary anger? I think not. I am sure not. She dotes upon you so, you naughty good-for-nothing man, that she would pardon you anything. And, indeed, I believe the next place in her heart is mine, and that she would be miserable without me. Dearest, something tells me we shall conquer. You shall leave that odious regiment, quit gaming, racing, and be a good boy, and we shall all live in Park Lane, and ma tante shall leave us all her money. I shall try and walk tomorrow at 3 in the usual place. If Miss B accompanies me, you must come to dinner and bring an answer, and put it in the 3rd volume of Porteus's Sermons. But, at all events, come to your own. R. To Miss Eliza Stiles, at Mr. Barnett's, Sadler, Knightsbridge. And I trust there is no reader of this little story who has not discernment enough to perceive that the Miss Eliza Stiles, an old schoolfellow, Rebecca said, with whom she had resumed an active correspondence of late, and who used to fetch these letters from the Sadlers, wore brass spurs and large curling mustachios, and indeed was no other than Captain Rawdon Crawley. End of chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Daniel Harris. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. Chapter 16. The Letter on the Pincushion. How they were married is not of the slightest consequence to anybody. What is to hinder a captain who is a major, and a young lady who is of age, from purchasing a license and uniting themselves at any church in this town? Who needs to be told that, if a woman has a will, she will assuredly find a way? My belief is that one day, when Miss Sharp had gone to pass the forenoon with her dear friend Miss Amelia Sedley in Russell Square, a lady very like her might have been seen entering a church in the city, in company with a gentleman with dyed mustachios, who, after a quarter of an hour's interval, escorted her back to the hackney coach in waiting, and that this was a quiet bridal party. And who on earth, after the daily experience we have, can question the probability of a gentleman marrying anybody? How many of the wise and learned have married their cooks? Did not Lord Eldon himself, the most prudent of men, make a runaway match? Were not Achilles and Ajax both in love with their servant maids? And are we to expect a heavy dragoon with strong desires and small brains, who had never controlled a passion in his life, to become prudent all of a sudden, and to refuse to pay any price for an indulgence to which he had a mind? If people only made prudent marriages, what a stop to population there would be! It seems to me, for my part, that Mr. Rawdon's marriage was one of the honestest actions which we shall have to record in any portion of that gentleman's biography which has to do with the present history. No one will say it is unmanly to be captivated by a woman, or, being captivated, to marry her, and the admiration, the delight, the passion, the wonder, the unbounded confidence and frantic adoration with which, by degrees, this big warrior got to regard the little Rebecca were feelings which, the ladies at least, will pronounce were not altogether discreditable to him. When she sang, every note thrilled in his dull soul, and tingled through his huge frame. When she spoke, he brought all the force of his brains to listen and wonder. If she was jocular, he used to revolve her jokes in his mind, and explode over them half an hour afterwards in the street, to the surprise of the groom in the tilbury by his side, or the comrade riding with him in Rotten Row. Her words were oracles to him, her smallest actions marked by an infallible grace and wisdom. "How she sings! How she paints!" thought he. "How she rode that kicking mare at Queen's Crawley!" and he would say to her in confidential moments, "By Jove, Beck, you're fit to be Commander-in-Chief or Archbishop of Canterbury, by Jove." Is his case a rare one? And don't we see every day in the world many an honest Hercules at the apron strings of Omphale, and great whiskered Samsons prostrate in Delilah's lap? When, then, Becky told him that the great crisis was near, and the time for action had arrived, Rawdon expressed himself as ready to act under her orders, as he would be to charge with his troops at the command of his colonel. There was no need for him to put his letter into the third volume of Portus. Rebecca easily found a means to get rid of Briggs, her companion, and met her faithful friend in the usual place on the next day. She had thought over matters a night, and communicated to Rawdon the result of her determinations. He agreed, of course, to everything, was quite sure that it was all right, that what she proposed was best, that Miss Crawley would infallibly relent, or come round, as he said, after a time. Had Rebecca's resolutions been entirely different, he would have followed them as implicitly. "You have had enough for the both of us, Beck," said he. "You're sure to get us out of this scrape. I never saw your equal, and I've met with some clippers in my time too." And with this simple confession of faith, the love-stricken dragoon left her to execute his part of the project which she had formed for the pair. It consisted simply in hiring of quiet lodgings at Brompton, or in the neighbourhood of the barracks, for Captain and Mrs. Crawley. For Rebecca had determined, and very prudently, we think, to fly. Rawdon was only too happy at her resolve. He had been entreating her to take this measure any time for weeks past. He pranced off to engage the lodgings with all the impetuosity of love. He agreed to pay 2 guineas a week so readily that the landlady regretted she had asked him so little. He ordered in a piano, and half a nursery house of flowers, and a heap of good things. As for shawls, kid gloves, silk stockings, gold French watches, bracelets, and perfumery, he sent them in with a profusion of blind love and unbounded credit. And having relieved his mind by this outpouring of generosity, he went back and dined nervously at the club, waiting until the great moment of his life should come. The occurrences of the previous day, the admirable conduct of Rebecca in refusing an offer so advantageous to her, the secret unhappiness preying upon her, the sweetness and silence with which she bore her affliction, made Miss Crawley much more tender than usual. An event of this nature, a marriage, or a refusal, or a proposal, thrills through a whole household of women, and sets their hysterical sympathies at work. As an observer of human nature, I regularly frequent St. George's, Hanover Square, during the genteel marriage season, and though I have never seen the bridegroom's male friends give way to tears, or the beadles and officiating clergy any way affected, yet it is not at all uncommon to see women who are not in the least concerned in the operations going on, old ladies who are long past marrying, stout middle-aged females with plenty of sons and daughters, let alone pretty young creatures in pink bonnets, who are on their promotion and may naturally take an interest in their ceremony. I say it is quite common to see the women present piping, sobbing, sniffling, hiding their little faces in little useless pocket handkerchiefs, and heaving, old and young, with emotion. When my friend, the fashionable John Pilmclow, married the lovely Lady Belgravia Green Parker, the excitement was so general that even the little snuffy old pew-opener who let me into the seat was in tears. And wherefore? I inquired of my own soul. She was not going to be married. Miss Crawley and Briggs, in a word, after the affair of Sir Pitt, indulged in the utmost luxury of sentiment, and Rebecca became an object of the most tender interest to them. In her absence, Miss Crawley solaced herself with the most sentimental of the novels in her library. Little Sharp, with her secret griefs, was a heroine of the day. That night Rebecca sang more sweetly and talked more pleasantly than she had ever been heard to do in Park Lane. She twined herself round the heart of Miss Crawley. She spoke lightly and laughingly of Sir Pitt's proposal, ridiculed it as the foolish fancy of an old man, and her eyes filled with tears, and Briggs' heart with unutterable pangs of defeat, as she said she deserved no other lot than to remain for ever with her dear benefactress. My little creature, the old lady said, I don't intend to let you stir for years, that you may depend upon. As for going back to that odious brother of mine after what has passed, it is out of the question. Here you stay with me and Briggs. Briggs wants to go see your relations very often. Briggs, you may go when you like. But as for you, my dear, you must stay and take care of the old woman. If Rod and Crawley had been there and present, instead of being at the club nervously drinking claret, the pair might have gone down on their knees before the old spinster, avowed all, and been forgiven in a twinkling. But that good chance was denied to the young couple, doubtless in order that this story might be written, in which numbers of their wonderful adventures are narrated, adventures which could never have occurred to them if they had been housed and sheltered under the comfortable, uninteresting forgiveness of Miss Crawley. Under Mrs. Firkin's orders, in the Park Lane establishment was a young woman from Hampshire, whose business it was, among other duties, to knock at Miss Sharp's door with that jug of hot water which Firkin would rather have perished than have presented to the intruder. This girl, bred on the family estate, had a brother in Captain Crawley's troop, and if the truth were known, I dare say it would come out that she was aware of certain arrangements which have a great deal to do with this history. At any rate, she purchased a yellow shawl, a pair of green boots, and a light blue hat with a red feather with 3 guineas which Rebecca gave her, and as little Sharp was by no means too liberal with her money, no doubt it was for services rendered that Betty Martin was so bribed. On the second day after Sir Pitt Crawley's offer to Miss Sharp, the sun rose as usual, and at the usual hour Betty Martin, the upstairs maid, knocked at the door of the governess's bedchamber. No answer was returned, and she knocked again. Silence was still uninterrupted, and Betty, with hot water, opened the door and entered the chamber. The little white dimity bed was as smooth and trim as on the day previous, when Betty's own hands had helped to make it. 2 little trunks were corded in one end of the room, and on the table before the window, on the pincushion, the great fat pincushion lined with pink inside, and twilled like a lady's nightcap, lay a letter. It had been reposing there probably all night. Betty advanced towards it on tiptoe, as if she were afraid to awake it, looked at it and around the room with an air of great wonder and satisfaction, took up the letter, and grinned intensely as she turned it round and over, and finally carried it to Miss Briggs' room below. How could Betty tell that the letter was for Miss Briggs, I should like to know? All the schooling Betty had was at Mrs. Bute Crawley's Sunday school, and she could no more read writing than Hebrew. "La, Miss Briggs!" the girl exclaimed. "Oh, miss, something must have happened. There's nobody in Miss Sharp's room. The bed ain't been slept in, and she've have run away, and left this letter for you, miss." "What?" cries Biggs, dropping her comb, the thin wisp of faded hair falling over her shoulders. "An elopement? Miss Sharp a fugitive? What is this?" And she eagerly broke the neat seal, and, as I say, devoured the contents of the letter addressed to her. "Dear Miss Briggs," the refugee wrote, "the kindest heart in the world, as yours is, will pity and sympathize with me and excuse me. With tears and prayers and blessings, I leave the home where the poor orphan has ever met with kindness and affection. Claims even superior to those of my benefactress call me hence. I go to my duty, to my husband. Yes, I am married. My husband commands me to seek the humble home which we call ours. Dearest Miss Briggs, break the news as your delicate sympathy will know how to do it, to my dear, my beloved friend and benefactress. Tell her, ere I went, I shed tears on her dear pillow, that pillow that I have so often soothed in sickness, that I long again to watch. Oh, with what joy shall I return to dear Park Lane! How I tremble for the answer which is to seal my fate! When Sir Pitt deigned to offer me his hand, an honour of which my beloved Miss Crawley said I was deserving, my blessings go with her, for judging the poor orphan worthy to be her sister. I told Sir Pitt that I was already a wife. Even he forgave me. But my courage failed me when I should have told him all, that I could not be his wife, for I was his daughter. I am wedded to the best and most generous of men. Miss Crawley's Rawdon is my Rawdon. At his command I open my lips and follow him to our humble home, as I would through the world. Oh, my excellent and kind friend, intercede with my Rawdon's beloved aunt for him and the poor girl to whom all his noble race have shown such unparalleled affection. Ask Miss Crawley to receive her children. I can say no more, but blessings, blessings on all in the dear house I leave. Praise your affectionate and grateful Rebecca Crawley. Midnight. Just as Briggs had finished reading this affecting and interesting document, which reinstated her in her position as first confidante of Miss Crawley, Mrs. Firkin entered the room. "Here's Mrs. Bute Crawley just arrived by the mail from Hampshire, and wants some tea. Will you come down and make breakfast, miss?" And, to the surprise of Firkin, clasping her dressing gown around her, the wisp of hair floating dishevelled behind her, the little curl papers still sticking in bunches round her forehead, Briggs sailed down to Mrs. Bute with the letter in her hand containing the wonderful news. "Oh, Mrs. Firkin," gasped Betty, "such a business! Miss Sharp have gone and run away with the captain, and they're off to Gretny Green." We would devote a chapter to describe the emotions of Mrs. Firkin, did not the passions of her mistress occupy our genteeler muse. When Mrs. Bute Crawley, numbed with midnight travelling, and warming herself at the newly crackling parlour fire, heard from Miss Briggs the intelligence of the clandestine marriage, she declared it was quite providential that she should have arrived at such a time to assist poor dear Miss Crawley in supporting the shock, that Rebecca was an artful little hussy of whom she had always had her suspicions, and that, as for Rawdon Crawley, she never could account for his aunt's infatuation regarding him, and had long considered him a profligate, lost, and abandoned being. And this awful conduct, Mrs. Bute said, will have at least this good effect: it will open poor dear Miss Crawley's eyes to the real character of this wicked man. Then Mrs. Bute had a comfortable hot toast and tea, and as there was a vacant room in the house now, there was no need for her to remain at the Gloucester Coffee House where the Portsmouth mail had set her down, and whence she ordered Mr. Bowles, aide de camp, the footman, to bring away her trunks. Miss Crawley, be it known, did not leave her room until near noon, taking chocolate in bed in the morning, while Becky Sharp read the Morning Post to her, or otherwise amusing herself or dawdling. The conspirators below agreed that they would spare the dear lady's feelings until she appeared in her drawing-room. Meanwhile, it was announced to her that Mrs. Bute Crawley had come up from Hampshire by the mail, was staying at the Gloucester, sent her love to Miss Crawley, and asked for breakfast with Miss Briggs. The arrival of Mrs. Bute, which would not have caused any extreme delight at another period, was hailed with pleasure now, Miss Crawley being pleased at the notion of a gossip with her sister-in-law regarding the late Lady Crawley, the funeral arrangements pending, and Sir Pitt's abrupt proposal to Rebecca. It was not until the old lady was fairly ensconced in her usual armchair in the drawing-room, and the preliminary embraces and inquiries had taken place between the ladies, that the conspirators thought it advisable to submit her to the operation. Who has not admired the artifices and delicate approaches with which women prepare their friends for bad news? Miss Crawley's two friends made such an apparatus of mystery before they broke the intelligence to her, that they had worked her out to the necessary degree of doubt and alarm. "And she refused Sir Pitt, my dear, dear Miss Crawley. Prepare yourself for it," Mrs. Bute said, because she couldn't help herself." "Of course there was a reason," Miss Crawley answered. "She liked somebody else. I told Briggs so yesterday." "Likes somebody else!" Briggs gasped. "Oh, my dear friend, she is married already!" "Married already!" Mrs. Bute chimed in, and both sat with clasped hands looking from each other at their victim. "Send her to me the instant she comes in. The little sly wretch, how dared she not tell me?" cried out Miss Crawley. "She won't come in soon. Prepare yourself, dear friend. She's gone out for a long time. She's gone altogether." "Goodness gracious! And who's to make my chocolate? Send for her and have her back. I desire that she come back," the old lady said. "She decamped last night, ma'am," cried Mrs. Butte. "She left a letter for me," Briggs exclaimed. "She's married to—" "Prepare her, for heaven's sake! Don't torture her, my dear Miss Briggs." "She's married to whom?" cries the spinster in a nervous fury. To a relation of—" "She refused Sir Pitt," cried the victim. "Speak at once. Don't drive me mad." "Oh, ma'am, prepare her, Miss Briggs. She's married to Rawdon Crawley." "Rawdon married Rebecca! Governess, nobody— Get out of my house, you fool! You idiot! You stupid old Briggs! How dare you? You're in the plot! You made him marry, thinking that I'd leave my money from him! You did, Martha!" The poor old lady screamed in hysteric sentences. "I, ma'am, ask a member of this family to marry a drawing master's daughter?" "Her mother was a Montmorency!" cried the old lady, pulling at the bell with all her might. "Her mother was an opera girl, and she has been on the stage, or worse, herself," said Mrs. Butte. Miss Crawley gave a final scream, and fell back in a faint. They were forced to take her back to the room which she had just quitted. One fit of hysterics succeeded another. The doctor was sent for. The apothecary arrived. Mrs. Butte took up the post of nurse by her bedside. "Her relations ought to be round about her," the amiable woman said. She had scarcely been carried up to her room when a new person arrived whom it was also necessary to break the news. This was Sir Pitt. "Where's Becky?" he said, coming in. "Where's her traps? She's coming with me to Queen's Crawley." "Have you not heard the astonishing intelligence regarding her surreptitious union?" Briggs asked. "What's that to me?" Sir Pitt asked. "I know she's married. That makes no odds. Tell her to come down at once and not keep me." "Are you not aware, sir," Miss Briggs asked, "that she has left our roof, to the dismay of Miss Crawley, who is nearly killed by the intelligence of Captain Rawdon's union with her?" When Sir Pitt Crawley heard that Rebecca was married to his son, he broke out into a fury of language, which it would do no good to repeat in this place, as indeed it sent poor Briggs shuddering out of the room. And with her we will shut the door upon the figure of the frenzied old man, wild with hatred and insane with baffled desire. One day after he went to Queen's Crawley, he burst like a madman into the room she used when there, dashed open her boxes with his foot, and flung about her papers, clothes, and other relics. Miss Horrocks, the butler's daughter, took some of them. The children dressed themselves and acted plays in the others. It was but a few days after the poor mother had gone to her lonely burying place, and was laid, unwept and disregarded, in a vault full of strangers. "Suppose the old lady doesn't come to?" Rawdon said to his little wife as they sat together in the snug little Brompton lodgings. She had been trying the new piano all morning. The new gloves fitted her to a nicety, and the new shawls became her wonderfully. The new rings glittered on her little hands, and the new watch ticked at her waist. "Suppose she doesn't come round, eh, Becky?" "I'll make your fortune," she said, and Delilah patted Samson's cheek. "You can do anything," he said, kissing the little hand. "By Jove, you can, and we'll drive down to the Star and Garter and dine, by Jove." End of chapter 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading by Daniel Harris. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. Chapter 17. How Captain Dobbin Bought a Piano. If there is any exhibition in all Vanity Fair which satire and sentiment can visit arm in arm together, where you light on the strangest contrasts, laughable and tearful, where you may be gentle and pathetic, or savage and cynical, with perfect propriety, it is at one of those public assemblies, a crowd of which are advertised every day in the last page of the Times newspaper, and over which the late Mr. George Robins used to preside with so much dignity. There are very few London people, as I fancy, who have not attended at these meetings, and all with a taste for moralizing must have thought, with a sensation and interest not a little startling and queer, of the day when their turn shall come too, and Mr. Hamerdown will sell by the orders of Diogenes Asignes, or will be instructed by the executors to offer to public competition the library, furniture, plate, wardrobe, and choice cellar wines of Epicurus deceased. Even with the most selfish disposition, the Vanity Fairian, as he witnesses this sordid part of the obsequies of a departed friend, can't but feel some sympathies and regret. My Lord Dives' remains are in the family vault. The statuaries are cutting an inscription veraciously commemorating his virtues, and the sorrows of his heir, who is disposing of his goods. What guests at Dives' table can pass a familiar house without a sigh? The familiar house of which the lights used to shine so cheerfully at 7 o'clock, of which the hall doors opened so readily, of which the obsequious servants, as you passed up the comfortable stair, sounded your name from landing to landing, until it reached the apartment where jolly old Dives welcomed his friends. What a number of them he had, and what a noble way of entertaining them! How witty people used to be here who were morose when they got out of the door! And how courteous and friendly men who slandered and hated each other everywhere else! He was pompous, but with such a cook what would one not swallow? He was rather dull, perhaps, but would not such wine make any conversation pleasant? We must get some of his Burgundy at any price, the mourners cried at his club. I got this old box at Dives' sale, Pincher says, handing it round. One of Louis XV's mistresses. Pretty thing, is it not? Sweet miniature. And they talk of the way in which young Dives is dissipating his fortune. How changed the house is, though! The front is patched over with bills, setting forth particulars of the furniture in staring capitals. They have hung a shred of carpet out of an upstairs window. A half-dozen of porters are lounging on the dirty steps. The hall swarms with dingy guests of oriental countenance, who thrust printed cards into your hand and offer a bid. Old women and amateurs have invaded the upper apartments, pinching the bed curtains, poking into the feathers, shampooing the mattresses, and clapping the wardrobe drawers to and fro. Enterprising young housekeepers are measuring the looking-glasses and hangings to see if they will suit the new menage. Snob will brag for years he has purchased this or that at Dives' sale. And Mr. Hamerdown is sitting on the great mahogany dining tables in the dining room below, waving the ivory hammer, and employing all the artifices of eloquence, enthusiasm, entreaty, reason, despair, shouting to his people, satirizing Mr. Davids for his sluggishness, inspiriting Mr. Moss into action, imploring, commanding, bellowing, till down comes the hammer like fate, and we pass to the next lot. Oh, Dives, who would ever have thought, as we sat round the broad table sparkling with plate and spotless linen, to have seen such a dish at the head of it as that roaring auctioneer? It was rather late in the sale. The excellent drawing-room furniture by the best makers, the rare and famous wine selected regardless of cost, and with the well-known taste of the purchaser, the rich and complete set of family plate had been sold on the previous days. Certain of the best wines, which all had a great character among amateurs in the neighbourhood, had been purchased for his master, who knew them very well, by the butler of our friend John Osborne, Esquire, of Russell Square. A small portion of the most useful articles of the plate had been bought by some young stockbrokers from the city, and now the public being invited to the purchase of some minor objects, it happened that the orator on the table was expatiating on the merits of a picture which he sought to recommend to his audience. It was by no means so select or numerous a company as had attended the previous days of the auction. "Number 369, roared Mr. Hamerdown. "Portrait of a gentleman on an elephant. Who'll bid for the gentleman on the elephant? Lift up the picture, Blowman, and let the company examine this lot." A long, pale, military-looking gentleman, seated demurely at the mahogany table, could not help grinning at this valuable lot, as shown by Mr. Blowman. "Turn the elephant to the captain, Blowman. What shall we say, sir, for the elephant?" But the captain, blushing in a very hurried and discomfited manner, turned away his head. "Shall we say 20 guineas for this work of art? 15? 5? Name your own price. The gentleman without the elephant is worth £5. "I wonder it ain't come down with him," said a professional wag. "He's anyhow a precious big one." At which, for the elephant rider was presented as of a very stout figure, there was a general giggle in the room. "Don't be trying to deprecate the value of the lot, Mr. Moss," Mr. Hammerdown said. "Let the company examine it as a work of art. The attitude of the gallant animal quite according to nature. The gentleman in a nankeen jacket, his gun in his hand, is going to the chase. In the distance a banyan tree and a pagody, most likely resemblances of some interesting spot in our famous eastern possessions. How much for this lot? Come, gentlemen, don't keep me here all day." Someone bid 5 shillings, at which the military gentleman looked towards the quarter from which this splendid offer had come, and there saw another officer with a young lady on his arm, who both appeared to be highly amused with the scene, and whom, finally, this lot was knocked down for half a guinea. He at the table looked more surprised and discomposed than ever when he spied this pair, and his head sank into his military collar, and he turned his back upon them, so as to avoid them altogether. Of all the articles which Mr. Hammerdown had the honour to offer for public competition that day, it is not our purpose to make mention, save one only, a little square piano, which came down from the upper regions of the house, the state grand piano having been disposed of previously. This the young lady tried with a rapid and skilful hand, making the officer blush and start again, and for it, when its turn came, her agent began to bid. But there was an opposition here. The Hebrew aide-de-camp in the service of the officer at the table bid against the Hebrew gentleman employed by the elephant purchasers, and a brisk battle ensued over this little piano, the combatants being greatly encouraged by Mr. Hammerdown. At last, when the competition had been prolonged for some time, the elephant captain and lady desisted from the race, and the hammer coming down, the auctioneer said, "Mr. Lewis, 25. And Mr. Lewis's chief thus became the proprietor of that little square piano. Having effected the purchase, he sat up as if he was greatly relieved, and the unsuccessful competitors catching a glimpse of him at this moment, the lady said to her friend, "Why, Rawdon, it's Captain Dobbin." I suppose Becky was discontented with the new piano her husband had hired for her, or perhaps the proprietors of that instrument had fetched it away, declining farther credit, or perhaps she had a particular attachment for the one which she had just tried to purchase, recollecting it in old days, when she used to play upon it, in the little sitting room of our dear Amelia Sedley. The sale was at the old house in Russell Square, where we passed some evenings together at the beginning of this story. Good old John Sedley was a ruined man. His name had been proclaimed as a defaulter on the Stock Exchange, and his bankruptcy and commercial extermination had followed. Mr. Osborne's butler came to buy some of his famous port wine to transfer to the cellars over the way. As for 12 well-manufactured silver spoons and forks at per ounce, and 12 dessert ditto, there were 3 young stockbrokers, Messrs. Dale, Spigot, and Dale of Threadneedle Street indeed, who, having had dealings with the old man, and kindnesses from him in the days when he was kind to everybody with whom he dealt, sent this little spar out of the wreck with their love to good Mrs. Sedley, and with respect to the piano, as it had been Amelia's, and as she might miss it and want one now, and as Captain William Dobbin could no more play upon it than he could dance on the tightrope, it is probable that he did not purchase the instrument for his own use. In a word, it arrived that evening at a wonderful small cottage in a street leading from the Fulham Road, one of those streets which have the finest of romantic names. This was called St. Adelaide Villas, Anna Maria Road West, where the houses looked like baby houses, where the people, looking out of the first floor windows, must infallibly, as you think, sit with their feet in the parlours, where the shrubs in the little gardens in front bloom with a perennial display of little chickens' pianofortes, little red socks, caps, etc., polyandra polygynia, whence you hear the sound of jingling spinets and women singing, where little porter-pots hang on the railings sunning themselves, whither of evenings you see city clerks padding warily. Here it was that Mr. Clapp, the clerk of Mr. Sedley, had his domicile, and in this asylum the good old gentleman hid his head with his wife and daughter when the crash came. Jos Sedley had acted as a man of his disposition would, when the announcement of the family misfortune reached him. He did not come to London, but he wrote to his mother to draw upon his agents for whatever money was wanted, so that his kind, broken-spirited old parents had no present poverty to fear. This done, Jos went on at the boarding-house at Cheltenham pretty much as before. He drove to his curricle, he drank his claret, he played his rubber, he told his Indian stories, and the Irish widow consoled and flattered him as usual. His present of money, needful as it was, made little impression on his parents, and I have heard Amelia say that the first day on which she saw her father lift up his head after the failure was on the receipt of the packet of forks and spoons with the young stockbroker's love, over which he burst out crying like a child, being greatly more affected than even his wife, to whom the present was addressed. Edward Dale, the junior of the house, who purchased the spoons for the firm, was, in fact, very sweet upon Amelia, and offered for her in spite of all. He married Miss Louisa Cutts, daughter of Hyam and Cutts, the eminent corn factors, with a handsome fortune in 1820, and is now living in splendour, and with a numerous family at his elegant villa, Muswell Hill. But we must not let the recollections of this good fellow cause us to diverge from the principal history. I hope the reader has much too good an opinion of Captain and Mrs. Crawley to suppose that they ever would have dreamed of paying a visit to so remote a district as Bloomsbury, if they thought the family whom they proposed to honour with a visit were not merely out of fashion, but out of money, and could be serviceable to them in no possible manner. Rebecca was entirely surprised at the sight of the comfortable old house where she had met with no small kindness, ransacked by brokers and bargainers, and its quiet family treasures given up to public desecration and plunder. A month after her flight, she had bethought her of Amelia, and Rawdon, with a horse laugh, had expressed a perfect willingness to see young George Osborne again. "He's a very agreeable acquaintance, Beck," the wag added. "I'd like to sell him another horse, Beck. I'd like to play a few more games at billiards with him. He'd be what I call useful just now, Mrs. C. Ha ha!" By which sort of speech it is not to be supposed that Rawdon Crawley had a deliberate desire to cheat Mr. Osborne at play, but only wished to take that fair advantage of him which almost every sporting gentleman in Vanity Fair considers to be his due from his neighbour. The old aunt was long in coming to. A month had elapsed. Rawdon was denied the door by Mr. Bowles. His servants could not get a lodgment in the house at Park Lane. His letters were sent back unopened. Miss Crawley never stirred out. She was unwell, and Mrs. Bute remained still and never left her. Crawley and his wife, both of them, augured evil from the continued presence of Mrs. Bute. "Gad, I begin to perceive now why she was always bringing us together at Queen's Crawley," Rawdon said. "What an artful little woman!" ejaculated Rebecca. "Well, I don't regret it, if you don't," the captain cried, still in amorous rapture with his wife, who rewarded him with a kiss by way of reply, and was indeed not a little gratified by the generous confidence of her husband. "If he had had a little more brains," she thought to herself, "I might make something of him." But she never let him perceive the opinion she had of him, listened with indefatigable complacency to his stories of the stable and the mess, laughed at his jokes, felt the greatest interest in Jack Spatterdash, whose cab horse had come down, and Bob Martingale, who had been taken up in a gambling house, and Tom Cinquebars, who was going to ride the steeplechase. When he came home she was alert and happy. When he went out she pressed him to go. When he stayed at home she played and sang for him, made him good drinks, superintended his dinner, warmed his slippers, and steeped his soul in comfort. The best of women, I've heard my grandmother say, are hypocrites. We don't know how much they hide from us, how watchful they are when they seem the most artless and confidential, how often those frank smiles which they wear so easily are traps to cajole or elude or disarm. I don't mean in your mere coquettes, but your domestic models and paragons of female virtue. Who has not seen a woman hide the dullness of a stupid husband, or coax the fury of a savage one? We accept this amiable slavishness, and praise a woman for it. We call this pretty treachery truth. A good housewife is of necessity a humbug, and Cornelia's husband was hoodwinked, as Poppethar was, only in a different way. By these attentions, that veteran rake, Rawdon Crawley, found himself converted into a very happy and submissive married man. His former haunts knew him not. They asked about him once or twice at his clubs, but did not miss him much. In these booths of Vanity Fair people seldom do miss each other. His secluded wife ever smiling and cheerful, his little comfortable lodgings, snug meals, and homely evenings had all the charms of novelty and secrecy. The marriage was not yet declared to the world, or published in the Morning Post. All his creditors would have come rushing on him in a body, had they known that he was united to a woman without fortune. "My relations won't cry fie upon me," Becky said with rather a bitter laugh, and she was quite contented to wait until the old aunt should be reconciled before she claimed her place in society. So she lived at Brompton, and meanwhile saw no one, only those few of her husband's male companions who were admitted into her little dining room. These were all charmed with her. The little dinners, the laughing and chatting, the music afterwards delighted all who participated in these enjoyments. Major Martingale never thought about asking to see the marriage license. Captain Cinquebars was perfectly enchanted with her skill in making punch. And young Lieutenant Spatterdash, who was quite fond of piquet, and whom Crawley would often invite, was evidently and quickly smitten by Mrs. Crawley, but her own circumspection and modesty never forsook her for a moment, and Crawley's reputation as a fire-eating and jealous warrior was a further and complete defence to his little wife. There are gentlemen of very good blood and fashion in this city who never have entered a lady's drawing-room, so that though Rawdon Crawley's marriage might be talked about in his county, where, of course, Mrs. Bute had spread the news, in London it was doubted, or not heeded, or not talked about at all. He lived comfortably on credit. He had a large capital of debts which, laid out judiciously, will carry a man along for many years, and on which certain men about town contrive to live 100 times better than even men with ready money can do. Indeed, who is there that walks London streets, but can point out a half-dozen of men riding by him splendidly while he is on foot, courted by fashion, bowed into their carriages by tradesmen, denying themselves nothing, and living on who knows what? We see Jack Thriftless prancing in the park, or darting in his brougham down Pall Mall. We eat his dinner served on his miraculous plate. How did this begin, we say, or where will it end? "My dear fellow," I heard Jack once say, "I owe money in every capital in Europe. The end must come some day, but in the meantime Jack thrives as much as ever. People are glad enough to shake him by the hand, ignore the little dark stories that are whispered every now and then against him, and pronounce him a good-natured, jovial, reckless fellow." Truth obliges us to confess that Rebecca had married a gentleman of this order. Everything was plentiful in his house but ready money, of which their menage pretty early felt their want. And reading the Gazette one day, and coming upon the announcement of Lieutenant G. Osborne to be captain by purchase, Vice Smith, who exchanges, Rawdon uttered that sentiment regarding Amelia's lover which ended in the visit to Russell Square. When Rawdon and his wife wished to communicate with Captain Dobbin at the sale, and to know particulars of the catastrophe which had befallen Rebecca's old acquaintances, the captain had vanished, and such information as they got was from a stray porter or broker at the auction. "Look at them with their hooked beaks," Becky said, getting into the buggy, her picture under her arm, in great glee. "They're like vultures after a battle." "Don't know. Never was in auction, my dear. Ask Martingale. He was in Spain, aide-de-camp to General Blazes." "He was a very kind old man, Mr. Sedley," Rebecca said. "I'm really sorry he's gone wrong." "Oh, stockbrokers, bankrupts, used to it, you know," Rawdon replied, cutting a fly off the horse's ear. "I wish we could have afforded some of the plate, Rawdon," the wife continued sentimentally. 25 guineas was monstrously dear for that little piano. We chose it at Broadwood's for Amelia when she came from school. It only cost 35 then. What d'ye call 'em, Osborne will cry off now, I suppose, since the family is smashed. How cut up your pretty little friend will be. Hey, Becky? "I dare say she'll recover it," Becky said with a smile, and they drove on and talked about something else. End of chapter 17.